first panel, which will be conflict and peace building, youths as agents of change. And to introduce the panel, I will first call out our chair, who is Naledi Maite, and she is an LSE Atlantic Fellow, feminist movement builder, and civil society professional.
Good morning, distinguished guests, and welcome to this first panel discussion of the 2023 LSE Africa Summit. As I've been introduced, my name is Naledi Maite, but I think simply I'm a master's student here at the London School of Economics, and I will be the moderator for this panel on conflict and peace building. This is an important yet very difficult topic. African societies are riddled with many complexities and impeding factors which tend to drive these societies towards violence and conflict. From Eswatini to the streets of Lagos, to the DRC, to the streets of Kampala, to the Sahel and beyond, the winds of discontent are raging. Conflict is by far one of the worst human experiences. It bears bare our fragilities. It ends the lives of the people that we hold dear. It causes grave bodily harm. It makes us fight for each breath. It strips us of dignity, suspends our lives, destroys community and communities, and creates an endless cycle of limbo and also breeds fear. For many Africans, trauma runs deep in our DNA, as many of us are yet to live or know life without conflict or violence. Conflict leaves us with nothing and has us question our sense of being and humanity. And so dreaming of a better and prosperous tomorrow is an impossible task when today is not promised. In a recent State of the Nation address, the president of my country, South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, kind of first admitted, the failures of the South African government, and then continued to commend the South African people for riding the wave, and stated that he was proud of the fact that we were a nation defined by hope and resilience. Now, this statement really made me upset, and it's something that a lot of African leaders like to exploit. For so long, we have survived on this diet of resilience and hope. This narrative of African people being resilient and full of hope invisibilizes our pain and our suffering. It turns a blind eye to the fact that we are tired of war and we are tired of enduring conflict and insecurity, and that we are discouraged in investing in this imaginary prosperous future which is no longer safe in the hands of current leadership. The 2020 African Union commissioned study on the roles and contributions of youth to peace and security in Africa tells a story of how young people have risen into leadership, picked up the pieces, and how they have dedicated their lives to contribute towards advancing Aspiration 4 of Agenda 2063, which is to contribute towards a peaceful and secure Africa. In the villages, slums, and cities of our continent, young people are hard at work, not only silencing the guns, but also in building and sustaining peace. This report, in essence, recognizes the fact that young people are unsung heroes of the Africa Peace Agenda. Our task this morning is to discuss and to gain a better understanding of the conflict prevention mechanisms that exist on the continent, their successes and also their failures, as well as to explore the ways in which we can sustain, but most importantly, how the role of the youth can be strengthened and elevated. Joining me to unpack this very important topic are our four panelists, and I've seen two of them. I'm sure the rest have also joined us during this time. But in no particular order, please help me in welcoming Dr. Roger Koranteng. Dr. Koranteng is the head of the Public Sector Governance at the Commonwealth Secretariat here in the United Kingdom. I'd also like to invite Fatma Ahmed. Fatma is the capacity building specialist at UNDP, and she's based in Addis Ababa. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Olawale Ismail. Dr. Ismail is a senior lecturer in leadership, peace, and development education at the Africa Leadership Center at King's College. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Lalji Aina. Lalji is an international security analyst and development policy expert, and is also a PhD student in the African Leadership Center at King's College London. We also like to invite all of you to participate in this discussion. Our panelists are going to do a sterling job in laying the foundation for us, but I think what we aim for is for a dialogue. What we'd like to hear from you are, your perceptions on sort of the youth, peace, and security agenda on the continent. We'd like to also hear about the kinds of work that you're doing on the ground, and also some of the recommendations about how it is that we go forward in ensuring that we silence these guns permanently in our societies. And so, the African Union has classified the category of youth as people from ages 15 to 35. So if you are in that particular bracket, it is your voice that we want to hear, particularly today. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us, dear panelists. So I think that usually discussions on peace and security, sometimes when they happen, tend to be devoid of the human experience. And so I'd really like us to first perhaps begin by centering each of us, right? And I think reflecting collectively on what our respective aspirations of peace are. And so the first question is, and really to each of you, and also something for you to reflect on, is what does peace mean to you? We'll start that side.
Okay. Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning. Good morning, panelists. Good morning, everyone. I think for me, peace essentially, to put it very mildly, is the absence of conflict, absence of war, absence of tension, struggles. But again, I'm of the opinion that you don't prepare for war during war. So you prepare for war during peace, okay? And that said, peace in itself is not necessarily an end product, but it's mostly a means towards an end. So there are lots of processes that takes you through, the attainment of peace, as an end goal, if you would. But it's not necessarily an end goal because, peace in itself has to do a lot with compromise, especially where you have divergent interests and people trying to give expression to these interests, which is what results in war, in the first place. So having to be able to manage these interests in such a way that does accommodate the views as much as possible of others, and especially the interests of various groups and institutions, as they may be, or perhaps maybe even, interest generally. This would be the pinnacle for the attainment of peace. So just to summarize, peace isn't an end goal. It's mostly a process, and it's not something that's achieved or obtained overnight. It has a lot to do with compromise, making concessions here and there, but with the view of trying to enjoy a semblance, of harmony, unity, in the absence of, say, conflict, tensions, or war. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Dr. Ismail?
Yes, thank you. Some 20 years ago, I was involved in a survey research on peace in West Africa. And when we did the research with some other colleagues, what came out when we asked ordinary people in West Africa mostly, what does peace mean to them? What is their own vision of peace? the majority of people said peace is peace of mind. When we interrogated what that peace of mind means in African context to the African, in a typical African community or to African population, it means a number of things that if we extrapolate it and we elevate it, it also speaks to some of the debate we see in academic, theoretical, debate, work by Johan Galtung and the rest. When we interrogated what this means, we found 3 or 4 key things that people refer to. 1, state of physical safety, physical security in their community, in their homes. That was 1. Secondly, sense of inclusion, sense of ownership, sense of belonging in processes happening in and around their communities. So this means that there is peace when people feel they have not been left behind or they are not represented in any mechanisms that relate to decision making that affects them but also affects their community. The third thing we also found was a sense of empowerment. And this goes back to debate in development about development as capability, that people want a situation or people see peace as a situation whereby they are able to fulfill their own potentials individually and also as collectively as a community. And the final thing we found was also a sense of freedom. Freedom to express, freedom to associate, freedom to engage in businesses, to travel, to move about. So these were the 4 key things that came out of that survey some 20 years ago. And I bet that those things are still as relevant today as they were 20 years ago. And I doubt if, even when we look at it beyond now, if those things will never stop, being relevant. But the final thing to also say is that in some of the classes that I teach, this is one of the rhetorical questions that we ask. And students often come back to say, or part of the question that we end up with is, there is no perfectly peaceful society. There is no, archetypal peaceful society to say this is the aspiration. This is, when you are talking about peace, this is what it looks like. So what it means is that peace is also a spectrum. And different societies at different points in history, at different period of their evolution, they can make progress towards it, but sometimes they also slide. Some 15, 20 years ago, people hailed, the Scandinavian countries as the closest thing to a peaceful society. But we've seen in the last 10, 15 years how issues of organized crime, violent extremism, issues around migration, immigration, and all of that, they are beginning to tear those Scandinavian countries apart. So what it means is that, peace is, at a level you can say it's a mirage. It's a journey, it's a spectrum. You make progress along it, but you can also backslide. So depending on what policies you make, the choices you make at different points in time, the type of government you have, the nature of your politics, the nature of your population, and the rest. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fatma?
No, thank you, and I agree with my co-panelists. Of course, peace is the absence of violence, right? But for me, and you said it as well, Naledi, in your speech about, we speak about resilience. We're on this diet of resilience, but for me, yes, peace is also the absence of violence, but it's also linked to prosperity, right? So being able to live in your country where you can live with dignity, where there are opportunities. So for me, I come from Somalia. My family migrated to Europe in the early 90s because they felt that was the only way for us to have a prosperous future, right? And that my story is not unique. Many people have migrated, and as Shido also said, are crossing and risking their lives because there's a lack of prosperity in their country. Also because there's lack of peace. So for me, I feel like it's important when we talk about peace is also to look at it of, yes, the absence of violence, where people can live with dignity, where there are opportunities, and that there's a conducive society where you can, where there are opportunities, where you don't have to migrate. So we really need to talk about, yes, the absence of violence, but also peace for me means that the ability to have opportunities within your country, where you can live prosperous and where you don't have to flee or leave just because of the lack of conducive environment.
Thank you. Dr. Koranteng?
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this important summit. I think it's interesting having listened to my colleagues panelists. So I think what I'm saying is almost wrapping up. So it's good that I'm speaking last because I've taken on board everything that I've been said. I'm looking at peace in different angles or facets. That peace is a state of calmness, tranquility, and a freedom from disturbance. It is a state of mind that is free from negative emotions such as anger, fear, anxiety, and a state of being that is characterized by harmony, balance, and a sense of well-being. That's one part of peace. Another part of peace will be a concept of social or societal friendship and a harmony in the absence of hostility and violence. In a social sense, peace is commonly used to mean lack of conflict, such as war, and freedom from fear of violence between individuals or groups. But peace means tranquility. Peace means being free from prosecution due to one's nationality, immigration status, race, ethnicity, political affiliation, religious belief, or lack of it, or sexual preferences. Peace comes from the comfort in knowing that you have a roof over your head, food to eat, and loving family members and friends. Many people are free from persecution, yes, but can they count on the comfort of shelter, food, and supportive social cycle? So peace may not necessarily mean an absence of war. Thank you.
That's wonderful. That was really so poetic, and I think all the reflections have been so important because, as I said, it really does humanize this topic and really brings us to the center as people who aspire for peace, right? Wanting to call home home, wanting security in statehood, the calmness and tranquility, a state of mind perhaps which is, outside of sort of negative emotions, security, inclusion, freedom of association, freedom of movement, and just generally, the freedom to just be. And really, this is something that we should never take for granted, and really reflecting on what is peace is something that we should use as the pinnacle that continues to bring fire to the struggle and to the continent that we want in the future. Fatma, I want to direct this particular question to you first. Is that usually when we think about conflict on the continent, sometimes we have like a, sort of like a one type of example like armed conflict, or perhaps many people understand conflict on the continent through the conflicts that make it onto the headlines, right? To start us off, are you able to give us like a bird's eye view of the conflict landscape on the continent, Yeah.
Sure. So just to center ourselves with some data, I'm going to spotlight 5 main trending or current concerns on the continent when it concerns to conflict. But in terms of data, so in preparing for this, I was looking at ACLED and looking at what is the current rate of events that are armed conflict on the continent. And in fact, it shows that there has been a decrease by 3.1%. But ironically, there has been an increase in the number of fatalities, which means that there is still a lot of conflict that is happening, and what are some of those causes? So one of the ones that I want to first start with flagging is that we've seen a huge resurgence of unconstitutional change in government. So we're seeing there's a lot of military coup d'etats, there's a lot of takeovers, and to some degree you're seeing citizens also jubilating some of this military. So it begs the question in terms of why are there this resurgence of unconstitutional changes in government? And in the last 24 months, we had seen 5 countries across Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, Guinea, and in Sudan, where there has been cases of coup d'etats. And I think that's a very alarming trend in terms of when we talk about challenges to peace and security on the continent. Because, of course, when you have these unconstitutional changes or challenges to democracy, it also means that, people's rights and all the things that we talked about what constitute peace is, the inclusion of people is absent, right? So I think this is a huge concern when it comes to the continent. And I was recently in Sudan where we have a research on looking at what are some of the resurgence and causes for military coup d'etats on the continent. So and one of the big important aspect was we wanted to speak to people to better understand why are some people jubilating these military, but why are they also protesting them at the same time when this honeymoon period is over. And I just wanted to quote one of the young people I spoke to in Nyala, Sudan, who says, "Dealing with arms doesn't establish schools, institutions, or provide services. We want a civilian government," right? So this also shows that not only is inclusivity important on the continent, but it's also about having a zero tolerance for some of these trends that are happening where there are takeovers of democratic systems. Other threats to the continent, I think we've heard about it and most of the times are on the headlines, is around terrorism and violent extremism. And we know that there has been a significant rise of violent extremism on the continent. We see Boko Haram or ISWAP being active in West Africa and the Sahel. We see Al-Shabaab also very active in eastern Somalia. We're also seeing insecurity in Mozambique and Cabo Delgado. So violent extremism also continues to be a big threat on the continent. We recently did a podcast on this, looking at what are some of the causes when we're talking about the root causes. Why are people joining? So there's a lot of resources out there, but this still continues to be one of the main issues on the continent is around violent extremism. We've also seen resource-based conflicts. We heard about this earlier about the impact of climate change, lack of scarcity of water. Myself and Wale are also doing this research on looking at farmers and herders. Why are there clashes between some of these communities? So these resource-based conflicts are also very much prevalent on the continent. I'm based in Ethiopia, and we've also seen there's a lot of still clashes in some countries, whether it's South Sudan or Ethiopia. So these conflicts also demonstrates that there's still a lot of reconciliation, a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of when there has been a change of government, how do we ensure that people are included? How do we also address some of the underlying issues? But yeah, just to summarize, violent extremism still is a persistent issue on the continent. These unconstitutional changes in government with military takeovers, and of course also looking at this nexus between climate change and insecurity and how it's impacting the broader environment.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Dr. Ismail, based on what, the picture that Fatma has painted for us, it's really clear that it seems like we're still a bit far from having these guns silenced. I'm also just reminded of she's speaking about the unconstitutional changes, sort of Article 4H, and just asking we have this instrument which is available for us, right, in order to be able to intervene on behalf of the people of this continent when such situations happen, right? 20 years after the formation of the AU, and with the AU came, it birthed us, so the African peace and security architecture. Can you perhaps reflect for us an analysis on, is this architecture effective? Are we using the norms that we've put in place? Is there an absence of courage? Why so much discontent, and why is it that this architecture is not coming to save the day?
Thank you. One of the interesting things you see in debates about Africa, and you go back to the OAU into the AU, people always, Africa is always in the same sentence. It's like an oxymoron. People talk about peace and security as if they are two different things. Of course, but peace is, incorporates element of security. But the key emphasis here is that the AU has always been particular about security and less about peace. So if you look at the way the APSA is set up, if you look at where resources have gone in, if you look at element of APSA that has been the most active, the most talked about, it has been the security element. Yeah. The peace element rarely gets mentioned. if at all they are mentioned, the amount of investment, the amount of effort, the amount of AU decisions, whether at summit level or whether at PSC level, that relate to security versus relating to peace. You will see where clearly where the emphasis is. And this has not been helped by the pattern of international assistance. The EU, United States, many of the allies of the AU and African countries, they are all interested about security on the continent. So areas or issues around peace, such as governance, you look at the latest Mo Ibrahim governance report and index, it shows Africa is backsliding big time. Even before COVID, but COVID has also accentuated that. So Africa is failing on governance issues and all the key parameters of that, including rule of law, including physical safety, including elections, including quality of economic opportunities and the rest. And then you also see elements that relate to the conversation we're having about everyday peace for everyday African, things that give people that peace of mind that people talked about. Of course, there are those that are more objective, but also there is a psychological dimension. It's a perfect state of feeling assured, not feeling threatened, not feeling any form of insecurity, not feeling hungry at home, not fearing police will come and arrest you or people will come and usurp your land, from nowhere. So if you look at the APSA, coming back to the APSA has always been about security. We can also have a debate about that security. How well has that APSA done in securing the physical safety of Africans? We know that peace goes beyond just physical safety. It's just one element of it. And I do recognize the fact that before you can talk about the psychological state of well-being of Africans, you need to have at least a modicum of physical safety. We can have debate about that. But even on the physical security, Africa has Africa Standby Force, and it has been permanently on standby. Unfortunately, there is an effort now to deploy it in Eastern DRC. We'll see how far that it's going to go. What it's going to achieve. But this is a mechanism that has gobbled so much money, so much effort, so much attention in the last 20 years on the continent. So now, if we evaluate Africa by itself, on itself, we will pass a less than average performance in terms of being able to assure security for Africans. I'm talking about people and everyday security. But in the same period that we are evaluating APSA and Africa, we also look at the global context. How well has the EU, how well has the UN and similar organizations, how well have they done as well in assuring physical safety of people? We also pass the same less than average performance. Why? Because the nature of challenges to physical safety, to insecurity globally has changed. Conflicts have mutated, they become a lot more wicked problems that defy all the conventional tools and institutions and mechanisms that have been created to address or to resolve some of these security challenges. So we can say Africa, the mechanisms have not done well, but it's a global phenomenon. We have to interpret that in the global context. But nonetheless, local communities outside of government have done a better job in addressing the security concerns and the peace needs of many African citizens on a daily basis. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Dr. Koranteng, as Dr. Ismail has just said right now, the continent has regressed in many ways, particularly in the area around governance. Your particular area of passion is that of governance and corruption. In one statement, I remember you said something about that, financial corruption in particular is a crime against humanity, and when you look at how much it takes away from the lives and livelihoods of people, And usually sometimes, like you're saying, we talk about security and peace. Something like corruption is not brought into the picture when we talk about issues of peace and security. And so from the perspective of the Commonwealth Secretariat, how does corruption fuel the problem that we're currently experiencing?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that important question. The big elephant in the room is always corruption. whether it's peace or security or whatever you want. On the continent, we have confronted with huge corruption. Now, for your specific question, corruption in the security space has been the common denominator of most of the conflicts in Africa. See, corruption has weakened defense and security forces, has fueled resentment against state representatives like our parliamentarians or politicians, and has enabled non-state armed actors to fill the vacuum. See, bad governance and corruption as the underpinning factors fueling violent conflict and civil strife in Africa. Conflict in Africa countries notably hinge upon bad governance and obviously corruption. And bad governance and corruption are deeply entrenched in the social, political, judicial, and economic systems, leading to bitter pent-up feelings among the population, particularly the youth, which are sometimes expressed through violence and rebelling against blatantly corrupt governments. Now, more of such conflict can be assured if African nations do not find effective means to discourage the greed of public officials and the rule-bending, private business people. Corruption erodes trust in government and undermines the social contract between government and the population. This is the cause of concern across Africa, particularly within the context of the fragility and the violence and the almost failing states, as corruption fuels and perpetuates the inequalities and the discontent that leads to fragility, violent extremism, and obviously conflict. So corruption is a major threat to even military effectiveness and contribute directly to insecurity. It has corrosive effect on the combat readiness and effectiveness, and undermines the ability to meet national security threats. Corruption in the military, intelligence, or the police services is part and parcel of the highly entrenched patronage network that exists in the political and economic system as a whole. In Africa, the social and the political consequences of corruption rob nations of resources and potential and drive inequality, resentment, and radicalization. So corruption cheats the continent governments of some 50 billion US dollars annually and stymies development, sustainable economies, and safe societies. So eradicating corruption is not only essential to establishing firm adherence to the rule of law and good governance and political stability, but is also critical in promoting economic growth and reducing poverty and empowering the youth. It weakens democratic institutions, perverts the rule of law, discourages investment, aid, and undercut public confidence in government, feeds inequality, and disenfranchises large segment of the population, particularly the youth. It is a severe obstacle to development and should be nipped in the bud with the aggressiveness it deserves. Now, with such a dire social and economic consequences at stake, the fight against corruption must be a priority, particularly for our future leaders, for those who are going to inherit, whether we like it or not. The generation will pass the baton to the younger generation. Now the question is that what kind of Africa are we going to inherit as a youth? What is the role of the youth? Because you have to take Africa, all of us in the youth. Of course, I'm much older, so I don't count myself. But the youth, you should ask the question, what is the future you want? What kind of Africa you want? When I heard that statement being made, I think it's the question that you should agitate the minds of all the youth. Because if you don't do away with corruption, there is no way, no other way that we can develop our continent. Everybody talks about Africa as the next global leader going into the future. After China, it should come to Africa. Are we ready? And that Africa that we should be ready for, who is this Africans? It's the youth. Because by the time it gets to Africa, the older generation must have passed on. Are you ready as a youth to take on the global leadership and become a global champion like we have in China now coming up? You have to prepare our youth. And you have to prepare yourself as a youth. And you have to deal with corruption. Say no to corruption. Promote accountability in your dailies. Form networks. And that's the only way we can take our rightful position in the globalized space.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you are taking notes because these are some of the questions that I think we should all collectively reflect on when we open the floor. Fola, I'd like to bring you in. I think that Dr. Koranteng gave a really perfect segue to the question that I'd like to ask you. Dr. Ismail now also just gave us a sense, well, pretty much reaffirming what I had said earlier about that the heroes of the day really have been ordinary people, right, in our communities who are doing the hard work of ensuring that peace comes, right? And so the report that the AU did in terms of the study of looking at the role of young people does quite a good job in, telling us about a lot of the initiatives that exist. But what's quite interesting and a glaring thing is that a lot of these initiatives exist very much on the periphery and in the grassroots. And when you look at, resolutions, UNCR, is it 2250, right? The resolution on youth, peace, and security pretty much urges member states to put young people really at the center of co-creating a lot of these interventions. And so the question is, what is this difficulty of getting young people to the center? We keep talking about it, the rhetoric, the biggest young population. Why are we not using it? What's the barriers?
Thank you very much for the very important question. So I think for a long time, and let me just start with this, for a very long time, the youths have been told that they are the leaders of tomorrow.
Yeah.
I've been hearing that since I was in elementary school.
Yeah.
I've always wondered, where's the tomorrow? So let me start off by saying the youths are no longer leaders of tomorrow.
Yes.
They are today's leaders in nation building and national development.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
earlier youths come to terms with that, the better they are able to touch that tomorrow they've been told about for a very long time. Now, having said that, I think essentially some of the relatable challenges and difficulties that the youths have encountered in this space has had to do broadly with two things. So I like to categorize them firstly as socioeconomic dimensions, and of course, secondly, the political dimensions. So by socioeconomic dimensions, I'm talking about hindrances such as poverty, inequality, lack of skills, lack of jobs, illiteracy, and the likes. And I'll try to just unpack them, one after the other. So as we've seen across the African continent, and not only peculiar to Africa, but also within other spaces, poverty to a large extent has been a trigger of violence. When people are hungry, when people are impoverished, when they are poor, the prospects of them perpetuating violence is significantly increased. Okay? Because I always like to use this example that someone who has a 9 to 5 job, who carries a briefcase to work every day and comes back and has a family to cater for, it's almost very difficult to persuade that person to drop their job and pick up arms against the state. It's somewhat very difficult. But someone, and from research, we've seen that people who join or get themselves involved in acts of violence that basically negates the peace are people who are idle, so to speak. So the youth aren't necessarily able, and this of course isn't an excuse for youth, but youth aren't necessarily able to articulate, their position in such a way that helps to translate the kinds of changes they want to see at top level beyond the grassroots, amongst other things because they fall within the spectrum of the mostly poor class of society. So in a lot of African societies, the youth are struggling to climb up the ladder. And I'll come to that when I talk about the political dimensions of why this is the case. And of course, we've seen this also with inequality, especially with women. There are instances where, just by virtue of being a woman, certain barriers are already put in place. This shouldn't be the case. I'm a strong advocate of women, taking on leadership positions and also being at the forefront, especially also, I believe, in things that have to do with peace building. So research has also shown that women tend to be more empathetic and they bring a lot of empathy to decision-making processes, which is very instrumental for peace building. Whereas sometimes with men, and of course this is not to say that this is general, but men always have a tendency, for instance, to just go straight to the point without necessarily taking into cognizance the unspoken language in the room, And there's also the issue of lack of jobs. So if people aren't employed, it's very difficult for them to advocate for peace. People need to be stable and secure financially, especially also in terms of housing. And if these things aren't in place, then they aren't able to be at their best to be able to offer the kind of change they would like to see, within society. Now, to go to the political dimensions, in a lot of countries in Africa, there are also political barriers, which has resulted in some forms of political marginalization. And this has made it very difficult for the youth to have entry into this political space where they can bring about the change they desire. And the reason is because there's a unwritten rule in Africa that says young people aren't ready for political office. And most of these decisions on peace building are taken at national level, where you have, dialogue with elites. And so the youths are always seen as, it's always been like a bottom-up approach, okay? And this in many ways has also eroded peace building, because it creates some form of distrust between state and society, and of course in this instance between the elites and young people. So I think it's fundamental that youth begin to harness their potential and mobilize resources in an organized way that makes them have a voice. So doing it in an isolated form, as we've seen within the grassroots, has been one of the reasons why it hasn't had so much traction at the national level. So the youth need to come together, shed their differences, and put the broader picture ahead of them. And we've seen this happen in some instances. So I'll give a very good example with the NSAS movement in Nigeria, where the allegations of police brutality by the police against young people. And we saw young people, mobilize themselves to try to make a point, that see enough is enough. And that caught the attention of the government, and they said we have certain requests, I think about 5 of them, and they put them before the government, and then the government was able to, try to come to a compromise to implementing these things. So those are some of the ways in which the youth can leverage their voice, but it can't be done in isolation, but more so, in unity, in harmony, and in a very organized form. And lastly, but not the least, everything, rises and falls, as they say, on leadership. But I want to add another layer which says everything rises and falls on politics. All right? To get the attention of the elite, the youth need to find their way into politics. And again, I'll give you another example of Nigeria, where you have Yaga, a group basically who tried to open up the political space for young people. Now, until the youth are able to make their way to this political space, then they will have a greater chance of having their voices heard. So a lot of people, and I think it's also very common across Africa, where young people tend to shy away from politics because they believe politics is just for a secluded group of people, politicians, the elites, the older generation. But I think we need to understand that to get their voices heard, and this is very important for young people, they need to get into the political space. That's the only way in which they can be taken more seriously. So youth should be more interested in coming out to vote, pushing forward people who have the skills, the knowledge, the understanding, the experience, and get out there to make a difference. Imagine in a continent where a significant amount of people are young people, and then you have older people, making decisions on behalf of young people. Some of the older people, and I mean no disrespect, some of them can't turn on the computer. And then you are making decisions for majority of young people. And it's important that young people, come into the space, and take charge of decisions that impact them directly. Especially also with regards to things that have to do with peace building, and conflict resolution, and also driving the kind of change and mechanisms you want to see within the space. Just to summarize, young people have a very significant role to play. And some of the barriers they've had have been mostly within the confines of socio-economic factors, and of course also political factors. And breaking these barriers is instrumental to getting their voices heard, including women, and girls. It's very important.
Great. Fatma, you do a lot of work and work practically with communities through the work that you're doing at UNDP. But I think also you've done quite a lot of work, under the Youth and Peace and Security ambit as well. Fola here was just reflecting on, what a lot of youth initiatives need to do better. And I'm also just thinking how, what are some of the best examples you could give us in terms of what's happening on the ground? But also, how do we support young-led initiatives more from a capacity perspective, and particularly resources is a sore issue.
No, and before I get into the examples, I think it's interesting when you're saying youth need to be together, they need to mobilize, they need to be empowered, but they are. But we also need to talk about the barriers that exist, right? So there are Youth for Peace, Youth for Peace initiative. There are so many initiatives. I'll draw on two examples about youth trying to be in politics. I was in Ghana and we were talking about what some of the barriers are for youth in terms of claiming the space and being the decision making. They're underfunded. They don't have allies or champions within government. They're actually gatekeepers and blockers, right? So at the same time, we also have to address that the barriers that do exist are beyond finances. And those are some of the gatekeepers and people who are in these spaces who don't want youth to be there. And if they are there, they're there for lip service. Look at the initiatives that we have. Look at we're having young people, but are they meaningfully included? Are they really being given the space to be part of the decision making? So I think those are definitely inherent issues. And then even when it comes to like peace building, we have all of these initiatives, and I know the UN Security Council 2250 speaks about we need to have youth in the room. Sub-Saharan Africa have 70% of youth. How can we exclude the majority? But then they are, right? So like in Sudan, for instance, there's a political transition process that's ongoing. The youth were organized. There are resistant committees who are organized. They know what they want. They have made inputs to the constitutions. They were listened to. But yet when the peace agreement was signed, they were excluded. They were not there. So I think as much as I want to highlight the positive examples that exist, we also have to be realistic. There are a lot of barriers that do exist, and we do need those allies and champions to stop being gatekeepers and also to acknowledge that they can actually contribute to the space. And if they are left out, there's a bigger issue, and we've heard about the issues that they have. But anyways, to try and focus on the positive and what has were the two examples. So for context, I've worked a lot in East Africa. And one of the initiatives that I was part of, and it's really grassroots led, which I appreciate, hence why I want to give the two examples. One is an initiative that's being led by UNDP, but another one that was completely led by young people. So there's a program called Peace Leaders, and as part of UN Security Council 2250, while Sweden was the chair of the Security Council, they invested a lot in some of these initiatives. So I had the pleasure of working with young people from this organization called FLIA, which is a youth organization in Sweden. Very small, but what they wanted to do was to develop a program. So I met this guy at the African Union. This was an initiative led by CEDO, the Citizens and Diaspora Unit, and they brought together all of these young people. But what was beautiful was that through this engagement, we connected and developed a program for Security Council 2250. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was, how do we ensure that we're not just reaching young people like ourselves in this room that are accessible? How are we reaching those people who are really at the heart of the community, right? So what we did was we worked with young people from Yemen, who are from people from Palestine, people from Kenya in the Kibera, in the slums, and really tried to find those young leaders who are already transformative agents in their community, but might not be invited to some of these spaces, right? And by bringing them together, we really focus on co-creating the curriculum. What are some of the capacity gaps that you have? Where are the entry points that you require? And I think what's beautiful about this program is that it's much more about the networks that have been created and these young people working with them, with each other organically. So they are sharing tips when they're having community meetings. If they've had barriers with intergenerational dialogue, they learn from these other experiences. So I really like that initiative because even now, without Sweden's funding, it's still ongoing. The network are still supporting one another. So my key message here in terms of these grassroots initiatives is how do we ensure that we're really reaching those people and that we're not just speaking to the people that we can reach, but how do we overcome some of these barriers? And that's people in the peripheries, people on the borderlands, people who perhaps might not be have access to this. So I think the main message here is also listening and understanding that these empowered individuals already have ideas. We need to just figure out how do we support them, whether it's through networks, whether it's through access, whether it's through sharing ideas. The other initiative, as you know, so I work at UNDP. UNDP does a lot of work that puts youth at the center across the work that we do, whether it's around the African Free Continental Trade Agreement and seeing how we work with youth and women as part of supporting the protocol, whether it's through our work with the governance and peace building team, where we're looking at how are young people working in the space on countering and preventing violent extremism. So there's lots of initiatives, but I think one of the initiatives that I have the privilege, because I work with them a lot, is the African Young Women Leadership Program. And this is a leadership and empowerment program that really wants to promote African women in particular to be in spaces where they can make change. So this is a joint initiative with the African Union, where we have around 33 fellows who are working across the different UNDP offices, and they're working on really important issues. And I think why those type of leadership programs are important is because, one, they are the future that they're already, and they're already operating in that capacity, like you said, right? So it's more like, how do we utilize these young women and these women, these people who are in these fellowship programs, to be able to challenge us and to keep us grounded on, are we really having a developmental impact? What are the results that we're having? And what I'd love to see is, unfortunately, like Dr. Olawale said, that a lot of security initiatives are funded. We know that primarily the development aid that does go to Africa focuses much more on security and stabilization, and that's unfortunate, because what does that mean? It means that we don't have enough funding for these types of fellowship programs, empowerment programs, and youth initiatives. So I think what we should also challenge our own self is that I think, one, it's clear that within the networks that we are in, there are a lot of potentials to create ideas and to influence programming, but also to think about, in this current climate, where we're seeing that a lot of developmental assistance that does go to Africa is perhaps shifting as a result of the war in Ukraine and other priorities that are happening, how do we access the resources that are within Africa? We keep saying that if you don't have an Africa strategy, you don't have a strategy. But then what are we doing? Are we utilizing the private sector? So I also would love us to see that as part of these peace building programs and capacity building programs, is that we're really looking at opportunities that exist and tapping into the skill set that we need for tomorrow. You know, with the fourth industrial revolution, do we have a high digital literacy rate? Are people able to utilize some of these skill set that we need for tomorrow, so that we can ensure that there are prosperity, there are opportunities, but also that people can live within peace because they know that there are opportunities accessible to them on the continent. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Koranteng, Fatma posed a challenge to us about the fact that it's easy to say to young people, stand up, you can do it. And that sometimes, as true as that is, and it's a rallying cry, I think, from all corners of our continent, is that young people have stood up and are doing something, but that there are real, sort of barriers that exist for real penetration and for them to really get to the core where they can really start controlling and changing things. So earlier you were giving us just examples. I'm just looking more for concrete examples, really, of how, and maybe not concrete, but also what are the tactics, strategic tactics, of being able to influence or intervene on the corruption aspects that you were talking about. You've been working for a long time here, so just practically though, sort of beyond stand up, what does a young person in Zimbabwe do regarding what's happening with leadership there and the corruption happening and any other places on the continent?
Okay, thank you for that. Let's look at the profile in the landscape in Africa in terms of the corruption and bad governance, and what can the youth situate themselves in, and what can they do. And I like the point that was made, that there's a lot of barriers against the youth in terms of penetration, in terms of mobility, in terms of taking the youth seriously in Africa, in terms of even fighting corruption and promoting good governance. We all understand the qualities that the youth have. The youth have creativity, the youth have dynamism, the youth have energy. But sometimes you get a feeling that these energy, dynamism are all over the place. They are not together in terms of building networks, in terms of activism, in terms of making their voice heard. So you have some good cases, as my colleague had mentioned, where you try to organize the youth in a way that they can make their voice heard and becomes a force to reckon with. In practical sense, I think that if you look at the African landscape, if you ask anybody, what is the key challenges confronting the continent, they will mention two things. One, bad leadership. Two, corruption. This underpins all the problems we are having. Does the government understand the role of the youth? Does the government take youth seriously? Because you see, what you have across is that you're going to go to various countries, you're going to have what they call the youth policy. Open that policy and see what is in there. And even if what they have there, see whether they are able to implement 1/50th of what is in that policy. It's mere document that nothing happens. So I think that for the youth to be able to take their destiny into their own hands, and whether we like it or not, like my colleague said, we said the youth are the future leaders. I still maintain the youth are the future leaders. Because when you were young, when you heard that, you were a very young man. Now you are a leader because you have grown into a leader. So the younger ones will come and take positions that we are holding now. And when they get there, the question is that, are they ready? And that is where I think we should be focused on attention when you're talking about the youth. Is the youth ready to take ownership? Are they ready to take leadership in Africa? Because let's face it, our leaders in Africa is nothing to write home about. They are all, I have to be careful. I wouldn't say they are all correct. And most of them also have reached their pensionable age, and yet they are still leaders. Instead of going home and trying to play with their grandchildren, and they are still there. They are, spent forces, and yet these are the leaders we have on the continent. And that's why I think that we should encourage the youth to take positions, responsibilities. I look at the landscape again, I see 14% of all parliamentarians on the continent are below the age of 40. Only 14% of our MPs on the continent are below the age of 40. So where is the youth? I think the problem is that first we should put system in place, mechanism in place, first to train the youth. And how do you train the youth? You have to put them in attachment, in responsible position to understudy and groom and think. Because if we don't put them in this position, first to understudy, when you're not going to be ready when the time comes. And I'm saying that the time, whether we like it or not, it will come. you're going to grow. The youth is going to grow. The older generation will pass away. Are you ready? Or you're going to be socialized into the bad ways of the elder. So that is the challenge I have. So what I think is that we want to lead youth leaders who are young, dynamic, to mobilize and get support. Another thing I've noticed is that we talk about lack of funding, lack of money. But I think if you have the capacity of the willpower and the aggressiveness and dynamism, you can go to where the money is. There's a lot of money available. In the Commonwealth Secretariat, we have a youth program. We can link youth, particularly when you're organized. Then we can link you to where you can have resources. We have Commonwealth Foundation. Their main role is to look at the civil society and youth groups to give them funding if you have a good project. So I'm saying that youth, you have to organize yourself. You have to first and foremost take your own responsibility to develop yourself. Because if you don't develop yourself, when you get to the point where you have to take leadership position, you may be bypassed or may do it wrongly. So the first responsibility is you, the youth. Craft a roadmap for yourself. Two, I think the society also have to look at the youth. That what kind of leaders are we going to hand over the next generation, the next leadership battle to? So it's incumbent on the society also to manage the youth and train them and groom them. And then government have a role, making resources available so that we leave our continent in a capable, free from corruption and dynamic people who can go to the world stage and make Africa proud. I think I'll end here.
Thank you. Do you need more developing, or are you ready now? I think is an important question. Fola, I want to link two things that you said earlier about that everything rises and falls on politics, and also your reflection on the fact that perhaps young people, in terms of the initiatives that they embark on, need more collaboration. I want to borrow the words of Dr. Samar Jabbar, who is a Palestinian activist and academic. And she stated once that solidarity is the antidote for social and political injustices. And she was just talking about and just elaborating on the fact that the people of Palestine would be flat on their backs was it not for the solidarity that they've received from the people of the world. And that through this particular solidarity, it has permitted them trauma recovery and has also had a healing effect. I'm always curious about solidarity amongst the young people of this continent, right? A lot of the time we talk about collaboration within our borders, and I think this came up earlier about, are we really doing enough with regards to cross-border collaborations? Are young people in Eswatini at all concerned about what's happening in Nigeria, and vice versa, right? And this question really to ask yourselves is that how engaged are you with the political struggles of other young people? So it's just what is the importance? Is this even important? Will this make an impact with regards to how we go about resolving the issues of conflict? But how important is the solidarity and tangible in terms of partnerships across borders?
I think this is very, very, very important. In the absence of some form of, and that's why I talked about compromise earlier. So perhaps maybe a word that might be very close to solidarity in this context would be compromise. Because one thing a lot of people fail to understand is that when you talk about the role of the youth within this space, it's important to understand that not every youth wants the same objective. Okay? So we're talking about making a distinction between the older generation and the younger generation. But it would be interesting to note that if an election were held here today, a lot of young people would prefer to vote for the older generation. And for so many reasons. I mean, some might be for personal reasons. Some might also be because they are attuned to the same philosophies or ideologies, as it were. So this is not to say that every young person wants to achieve some form of change, as it were. In fact, some young people are very comfortable with the status quo. All right, and that in itself, affects, the attainment of solidarity towards a common cause, as it were. But I think the most important thing, having said that, is to look at solidarity within the confines of attaining, say, peace or security in the interest of all, as a mutually inclusive objective. So irrespective of where you stand within the political spectrum, whatever your ideologies are, whatever your philosophies are, it's important to be able to translate and communicate a form of understanding that whether you are in Camp A or whether you are in Camp B, in the event of violence, everybody gets affected. Okay? So having to come to terms with these realities is the basis for the establishment of solidarity. And to do this, the youth must be able to work together by appreciating three fundamental things. The first is cultural differences. Okay, and I'll give you a very good example of this. So in Nigeria alone, which is where I come from, there are over 250 languages, and you can speak only just 2 of them. So in my own country, if someone else was speaking another language and I was trying to communicate to them, just by virtue of the fact that they may be saying something that may sound abusive in my own language is enough to serve as a trigger to me. But it doesn't necessarily mean they are abusing me. It just means that what they are saying sounds like an abusive, word in my own language. So having that understanding, that people see things differently as a result of their culture, belief systems, also even religion, ethnicity. These are some of the, hotspot issues that will serve as the basis for the establishment of solidarity. Once these things are properly managed within or amongst the youth, then it serves as the basis for the attainment of solidarity that leads to the attainment of greater purposes, greater objectives that are mutually inclusive. Okay, but to do this also, the youth first and foremost need to be aware. So what we've seen is also a lack of awareness on these divides. Okay, and when I say the lack of awareness is essentially reflected in the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to the pursuit of mutually inclusive goals and objectives, even with regards to solidarity, but coming from a place of empathy, compassion, and understanding that the way you see things might be very different from the way your neighbor sees things, sets the basis, for inclusivity. It sets the basis for dialogue. It sets the basis for solidarity. But having that understanding and awareness, which also comes from the place of education. So in Africa also, it's imperative to note that illiteracy to a large extent has been weaponized by the political elites, and especially the, those who are comfortable with the status quo. And so I think, just to summarize, I think it's important that the youth need to be very deliberate about having a mind shift, a reorientation about how they see the world around them. That in itself will set the basis for togetherness, for the ability to be able to work more closely together and shed their swords and differences towards the attainment of a common goal, especially with regards to pushing solidarity towards things like peace and security.
Great. Dr. Ismail, you look like you want to comment on that, but I also want to ask you a question that you can build on.
Okay.
I'd like us to perhaps end perhaps our panel interaction or this round of questions by ending where we began. We all shared our ideas about what peace means, and you were critiquing a lot of the ways in which the mechanisms were implemented and that they were very security biased and heavy. And so I think about many countries have got, ministries of security and defense. If countries had ministries of peace, what would those look like? What would be the outputs of those departments or ministries in helping us create the collective ideas that we spoke about when we were asking, what does peace mean to you? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think the question you've asked, I wanted to comment on what my other speakers have said, but I'll come back to that. I want to answer your question first. I am never a big fan of focusing too much methodologically on the official dome. what happens in government, what government can do, what UN is doing, what the agency is doing, what the African Union is doing. I'm not saying they are not important. They are important. But there are certain things that are far more important than that, and I'll come to that in a minute. But going back to your question, it raises the issue: who builds peace? Is it the soldiers? Is it the police? Is it the politicians? Who actually builds peace? How is peace built? Soldiers don't build peace. Peacekeepers, peace supporters, whatever name you call them, do not build peace. It is people in their communities, civil society coming together in the grassroots, finding ways to negotiate, to find negotiated settlement to dispute, finding ways to address issues of mutual concern, finding ways to respond to vulnerabilities as they face that build peace. So if and where governments create peace, you go to Kenya, there is a semblance of that. There is a military that coordinates the activities of local peace committees across Kenya. Ghana also has, similar architecture. Now there is this thing going around called peace architecture, and people are looking at structures of governance or government that are being created to promote peace, to advance peace. The most that such institutions, such ministries can play is to set policy frameworks and to also set maybe some guidance notes or provide training to some grassroots organizations. But the actual day-to-day building of peace happens in local communities at the level of grassroots. So I wanted to, park that there. Now, I wanted to pick up from what my other colleagues have said. There is something that is cooking in Africa, something that is brewing, which for me signifies the gradual evolution of a new Pan-Africanism, the gradual evolution of a new nation building, or call it state building project, that is beginning to emerge across Africa. So when you see young people, even though they loathe military rule, but they are cheering for soldiers taking over in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, they are not doing it because they want military rule over democracy. No, that is not the purpose of it. The same enthusiasm that young people have devoted to demonstrating, to protesting, to marching on the street across all African countries in the last 10 to 15 years is the same search for solution that young people, they want a new Africa, a new Pan-Africanism. There you see the moment there, a protest breaks out in Sudan, other African young people across across Africa and even in the diaspora, they are immediately mobilizing, they are immediately internationalizing the struggle as a way of putting a stop to the brutality of police to crush such protests. So there is that is beginning to brew. And that is one of the beautiful things that came out of Arab Spring. Arab Spring brought about what we call street power, street politics. Young people are now the sovereign in Africa. The sovereign is no longer the president, it's no longer the parliament. Young people are now the sovereign in Africa. They are the ones, they made a statement that if we cannot get rid of you through elections because you have manipulated the elections, we have the power to get rid of you outside of electoral cycle. And this put the African Union in a fix when Arab Spring started. Now it's not even up for debate anymore. Increasingly, mass protest has now become the basis for young people to exercise power that is denied them through formal politics, through formal elections. Now we've seen, if you look at what happened after Arab Spring in Burkina Faso, in Egypt, in Tunisia, and even in Sudan, where a kind of cooptation, administrative inclusion, was a way used to bring young people into the formal politics. We have seen that these have not made any difference. So we are now seeing the next phase of the struggle. It's a journey. Similar to, if you cast your way back to decolonization in Africa, it was a journey of 25, 30 years. It first started with political conscientization and consciousness, and then the struggle began and strategies changed. people across different parts of Africa were learning over, from one another, and they were changing strategy one decade after the other. I'm beginning to see, that also emerging from the failures of administrative cooptation into power arrangement in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Burkina Faso, in Sudan. We are now seeing young people competing for power. We've seen it in Nigeria in the last election. We've seen it as well in recent election in Uganda, in Liberia, in Kenya. Young people are now beginning to shape the outcomes of election. So they are now learning the strategy for grabbing power. They lacked the strategy during Arab Spring. Now we are seeing 10, 15 years after that, they are now adapting that strategy and they are learning. In the next 10 years, the strategy will get to the next level. So what is this, what does all of this tell us? I am not a fan of being prescriptive about young people should do this, should do that. Follow young people, follow their journey, follow their perspective, follow their priorities, follow the way they see the world and what is the kind of change they seek to bring about. Even where governments have not provided education for them, young people are learning on the street. They are doing self-learning, self-help through the internet. The internet penetrability in Africa is the most liberating force that has happened to the continent in the last 50 years. And it's what is going to change Africa in the next 50 years to come. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I think we've enjoyed ourselves too much here on the podium, and we really don't have too much time, but I'd really like to take some of your comments. As we said here, each of us has agency, so I hope it's not too many questions because we should be able to answer those for ourselves. But comments, that side went up very quickly. Yes, ma'am, you go ahead.
Introduce myself? Or?
Yes, your name and however else you want to.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Noni Uboma, Patricia Uboma. Actually a development consultant. I'm also doing my PhD at the UCL. I came in late and I was really quite upset about that, but fascinating conversation, and I was able to pick a couple of things, and I have some food for thought. I agree, it's not really about prescription. Looking at, and I have quite what I call 5 C's, looking at and trying to diagnose it, see some food for thought for all of us. Where we come from, sub-Saharan Africa, looking at the origin of this corruption we all talk about, and every time Africa is being labeled as corrupt and everything, and all countries in the world, human beings, you're always going to have corrupt people and good people. But looking at colonialism itself, and I need to go back a bit to go forward, and that institution itself being a corrupt institution seems to be, and I would argue, the bedrock of where a lot of the corrupt practices has come. And we must be mindful not to seek solutions where we're trying to put new wine in an old skin. And yes, there's a lot of role that young people can play in terms of the development of Africa. But our context needs to be taken into consideration. A lot of the solutions in terms of governance and institutions are really copy and paste solutions. And we, as African countries, need to look at our own context. What are those solutions that suit our context? If you look at how China operates, how Singapore, how other Southeast Asian countries, how they have developed paying attention to their context. And it's important that as African leaders and as Africans, be young people and whoever it is, look at what are our context. Let's look at our systems and see how we need to revise that.
Great. Noni, I'll take it there. We just don't have time.
The building
We have
of
to take.
capabilities. I'm just going to round up. The building of capabilities is really key to attract the right set of people into government, and then collaboration across the African continent is also important.
Great.
So like 5 C's.
Thank you. Organic solutions to our problems and sorry. Yes, you go next.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Musaraji. Just a quick, point on the way I think and the way I view how you should get involved. I put down here that how do we ensure that cerebral youth are the ones who take leadership, are the ones who take charge today? Because if we have cerebral adults in place today, we're not going to have the problem of succession that we're having now. You know, when you look at history, for example, you look at the history of Africa, you see that a whole lot of the leaders that took power at the time of independence, you know, are still in the political space today. At that time, they were youth, you know. So how do we ensure that the youth that take power today are not the same people or the same set of people that took power several years ago in, you know, in the context of African democracy? Um,
Okay, we're gonna.
and also, we need just a few points. I'll summarize. We need an aggressive youth education. We also need to learn that you don't gain experience with the passage of time, but you gain experience by aggressive education and quality experience.
I'm going to move on to the next person. I'm just looking at time. Thank you. Let's collaborate, short and sweet, please, so that we can get as many views as possible. You there in the middle.
Okay, so thank you. My name is Agre. I'm with the Marshall Institute here at LSE. I just want to come in on what Dr. Fola talked about, that the youth are not involved enough in politics. And it relates to what my brother has just said. I just want to first look at how we've all said the youth have been involved in activism, and total agreed have been involved in, and they're doing great in spaces like taking up executive professional spaces. The youth are doing great in entrepreneurship, all that. But there's something about the political space that seems to crush the youth on the continent. So I would not agree that the youth are not involved. I know, I would say they are, but there's something about that space where the dynamics change. And he said End SARS was a big successful campaign that happened in Nigeria, and it was largely led by the youth, and we often refer to it. But then in the same country, you just had an election where the youth sort of tried to rally behind one political individual, and the loss was a bit overwhelming. The same thing happened in Uganda, where the youth was crushed when they tried to come to join and participate into politics. It happened in Zimbabwe, and I think it's about to happen in South Africa as well. So every time you have youth get involved and they want themselves on the ballot, the crashing, the political system sort of seems to crush them so bad that they're back to the streets, they're back to where they're idle, as someone said, and the only thing they're left to do is to pick up arms and then take us back to the conflicts, to the wars that we're trying to run away from. Because this is what presidents like Museveni did, because they tried to participate politically, the system crushed them, and the only choice they had is to pick up arms and go to the bush. So that's where we're going to end up going, unless we tackle the issue of why is it that when we want to be on the ballot as youth, we get crushed so badly, yet we are involved in all these other spaces and we seem to be doing all right.
Great, thank you very much.
Morning, my name is Stephen Toya. I'm a barrister here in the UK. I'm also launching an international press think tank in Ghana in about 2 or 3 months. The question I have is quite simple. Listening to you talk about corruption from a youth perspective, what I wanted to know is how hardwired do you think corruption is in our society? And we obviously know the benefits of untangling and abolishing corruption, but what do you think we should be careful about in that process? The reason I asked that question, I lived in Ghana for about 2.5 years recently, and what I noticed was it was always very helpful to have the number of an engineer who worked for the electrical company of Ghana than to have the electrical company of Ghana's number, because that was the best way to get things solved. But if you look at that speech, what it often means is it's a transactional relationship, and it's obviously an example of corruption at a very small level. But what does that mean if you untangle that relationship? Because if you're being very honest, probably my transaction with him is a very big part of what he gets every month. And so what I'm essentially saying is, if you untangle that, the question is, how do we ensure our services work better and people are better paid? And how is that going to be achieved in modern day Africa? And so what is the converse of the point of breaking and abolishing corruption? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We'll go back this way. Ma'am in the yellow jacket here. Can I ask that you speak to the mic? Yeah.
You should put the speaker on.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Better.
My question goes to someone on the panel who mentioned that the elephant in the room is corruption. Now, I would wager that that elephant has swallowed another one, which is mismanagement of natural resources. And I think, I think my question to you, in peacemaking and in your various organizations, to what extent are you looking at the mismanagement of natural resources as part of the reason why we're constantly sort of in this rigmarole of, resource grabbing, quasi-feudalist sort of pseudo-oligarch type,
Great.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
economics.
I took two here. I have space for one, and I've. Okay, there you go.
Hi, I'm Ben. Analyst in the private sector. Questions aimed at Fatma. I lived in Sudan just before the coronavirus, and you mentioned that the grassroots mobilization there has been really strong, which of course it has been, probably one of the strongest on the continent. There's increasingly a gulf between the objectives of the grassroots protesters, who are mainly youth, and the actions and beliefs of the international community who are operating there, including the African Union, United Nations, who are supporting the political process, which is increasingly exclusive. So my question for you is, how can international organizations like the African Union, like the UN, who want to support grassroots youth, but also sort of have to deal with like national level elites, how do they more effectively manage that gap in that balance?
Great. Apologies to the organizers, maybe a 2-minute buffer. So, Dr. Koranteng, I think the question about there's already efficiencies in corruption, right? So when you resist, the fear of the fact that it crumbles what the little efficiency that people have created, right? And so, yeah, how do we, in resisting, how, what needs to be in place in order to build back better? And I think also the question of, an elephant swallowing another elephant, about what has been the role of the mismanagement of resources within compromising or contributing to conflict and compromising the peacemaking agenda. Yeah. 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. I'm also from Ghana, so I understand where the first question is coming from. My only answer at this moment will be that, you see, when it comes to service delivery, public service delivery, it's fraught with a lot of corruption, all because of the overbearing nature of government and government officials and all that. And so we have to look at what has happened in other countries around the world that have been able to provide efficient service to our countries. And one of the things that I know is the public-private partnerships. And again, public-private partnerships have been given such a bad name in some part of Africa, including our own country, Ghana. But the point is, let's face it, all that we want, citizens, is that we want efficient service, whether it's electricity or other utilities. All that we want is efficient service at a reasonable price. Than like it's happening, say, in South Africa. You have light-offs, killing industries, killing companies, office productivity is low and all that. So if we can get a private-public partnership that can deliver a service and regulate it properly so that the service will be efficiently delivered and it will be all time, all available for citizens. I think that's what government is supposed to be. However, most of African countries say, private sector is taking, foreigners is taking our assets, so we will allow that. So they want to retain the assets in public and run it down, and eventually what we do is that you privatize it, it's gone. So I think we should go for public-private partnership with a strong regulatory body so that they can provide efficient service delivery. Because at the end of the day, I want to see my light on. As to who owns it or who